What happens when a man who can buy anything meets a woman who can't be bought? Alexander Sterling, a name whispered in boardrooms where billions are moved like chess pieces, lived in a world of cold glass and colder transactions. He believed kindness was a currency for the weak, a myth told to make the poor feel better about their lot. To prove his cynical theory, he shed his custom-made suits and a net worth larger than a small country's GDP to walk into the grimiest corners of the city. He was looking for selfishness, for greed, for proof that humanity was as bankrupt as he felt. He found the Cornerstone Diner, and he found Isabella Rossi. He thought he was teaching the world a lesson. Instead, a waitress with worn-out shoes and a spine of steel was about to teach him one in kindness that he, and you, will never forget. Alexander Sterling adjusted the silk tie at his throat, his reflection staring back from the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse. The city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights that he owned a significant portion of. From this height, 80 stories above the street, the people were nothing but insignificant specks, their lives a distant hum. That's how he preferred it. Close contact bred complication, expectation, and, inevitably, disappointment. At 38, Alexander had achieved more than most could dream of in 10 lifetimes. His company, Sterling Dynamics, was at the forefront of AI and logistical solutions, a titan of industry that had made him one of the youngest and most reclusive multi-billionaires in the world. He had yachts he never used, houses he never visited, and a contact list that could command armies or sway markets. What he didn't have was a single genuine human connection. He'd concluded, after years of backstabbing partners, social climbing dates, and sycophantic employees, that such a thing didn't exist. People were tools, relationships were transactions. Kindness was a performance to get something in return. "The final proposal for the Henderson Foundation grant, sir," said Marcus Vance, his chief of staff, and the only person who dared to speak to him with a semblance of frankness. Marcus was a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed, with a calm demeanor that had weathered Alexander's most volatile storms. He placed a leather-bound folder on the vast obsidian desk. Alexander didn't turn from the window. $50 million to a foundation that claims to alleviate urban poverty. A rounding error. "It's a significant philanthropic gesture, Alexander," Marcus countered gently. "It will do a great deal of good for a great many people." "Will it?" Alexander finally turned, his grey eyes cold and analytical. "Or will it go to people who will squander it? People who see a handout and simply take? You talk of the deserving poor, Marcus. I'm beginning to believe they're a myth, a fairy tale we tell ourselves to justify the inequality we see from our towers. Prove to me that genuine, selfless kindness exists at the bottom. Show me one person who would give their last dollar to a stranger without wanting something in return, and I'll double the grant to 100 million. Marcus sighed. It was an old argument. Alexander's cynicism had calcified into a world-view. You can't quantify human decency on a spreadsheet. "Then I'll have to gather the data myself," Alexander said, a strange, sharp glint in his eye. "I'm tired of reports and projections. I want to see it. I want to walk among them." Marcus blinked. "Walk among them? What are you suggesting?" "An experiment. A field study," Alexander declared, a sudden, reckless energy seizing him. "I'm going to disappear for 1 month. No money, no name, no influence. I'll take a backpack, some second-hand clothes, and $100 in cash. I'll become one of them. I'll get a menial job, live in a hovel, and I will prove to you that at its core, humanity is a transactional, selfish machine. When I'm proven right, we'll restructure the grant to focus on merit-based incentives, not charitable black holes. Marcus was aghast. "This is insane. The security risk alone is astronomical. The board works for me." Alexander cut him off. "You will handle them. Tell them I'm on a private spiritual retreat. No contact. You will be my only link, a silent observer for emergency use only. I will carry a burner phone with your number. Do not call me unless I call you." He was already moving, pacing his vast living room, the plan solidifying in his mind. He would call himself Alex. Just Alex. No last name. He'd craft a believable backstory, a construction worker laid off after a project went bust, new to the city, down on his luck. He would strip away every layer of Alexander Sterling and see what the world gave back to the nobody that remained. "And where will this experiment take place?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with dread. Alexander pointed down, towards a distant, less glamorous part of the city, a cluster of brick buildings and warehouses that lacked the gleaming ambition of his own neighborhood. There, somewhere real, somewhere gritty, somewhere a man like me would never, ever be found. He was convinced he would return in a month, his beliefs validated, his cynicism sharpened into an even more effective tool for navigating the world. He would come back to his throne, ready to make a data-driven decision about his $50 million problem. He had no idea that his problem wasn't the $50 million. It was the man staring back at him from the window. And his lesson was waiting for him, not in a boardroom, but in a greasy spoon diner, under the tired, watchful eyes of a waitress named Bella. 3 days later, the transformation was complete. The $10,000 Brioni suit was replaced by stiff, ill-fitting jeans from a thrift store, smelling faintly of mothballs. The Patek Philippe watch was gone, his wrist feeling unnervingly bare. His hands, usually occupied with a stylus or a board report, were now calloused from a day spent moving boxes at a warehouse for cash in hand, a job he'd found after 6 hours of humbling pavement pounding. His name was Alex, and his home was a tiny, damp room in a boarding house that cost him $40 of his initial $100 for the week. The city he had once viewed from above was now a visceral, overwhelming assault on his senses. The stench of garbage in the alleyways, the screech of subway brakes, the press of anonymous bodies on the sidewalk. It was all real, suffocatingly so. He felt a constant, low-grade paranoia. Every person who looked at him felt like a threat. Every transaction, from buying a coffee to paying his rent, felt precarious. The safety net of his infinite wealth was gone, and he felt like a man walking a tightrope without the rope. By the end of his first week, he was hungry, exhausted, and more certain than ever of his hypothesis. The men at the warehouse were gruff and suspicious, caring only about their pay packet. His landlord was a weasel who tried to short-change him on his deposit. The world, as he was experiencing it, was indeed a dog-eat-dog affair. It was a rainy Tuesday night when he first stumbled into the Cornerstone Diner. The rain had plastered his thin jacket to his skin, and the meager $20 in his pocket felt like the last bastion against total destitution. The diner's sign, with a flickering O and N, cast a warm, if slightly pathetic, yellow glow onto the wet pavement. He pushed the door open, a small bell tinkling, and was hit by a wall of warm air, thick with the smell of fried onions, old coffee, and something vaguely sweet like burnt sugar. The place was a relic from another era. Red vinyl booths with patched-up tiers, a long formica countertop worn smooth by countless elbows, and a jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't played a song since 1985. It was mostly empty, save for a couple of tired-looking truckers at the counter and an elderly woman nursing a cup of tea in a booth. And then he saw her. She was behind the counter, her back to him, deftly handling 3 different orders at once. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours and endless repetition. She wore a simple, faded blue uniform, and her dark brown hair was pulled back into a messy but efficient ponytail. When she turned, he was momentarily taken aback. She wasn't beautiful in the sculpted, artificial way of the women in his world. Hers was a real, tangible beauty. She had a heart-shaped face, large, expressive brown eyes that seemed to see everything, and a mouth that was set in a firm, no-nonsense line, but looked like it knew how to smile. She also looked bone-tired. There were faint shadows under her eyes that even the diner's forgiving light couldn't hide. He slid into a booth, the vinyl sighing under his weight. He picked up the plastic-coated menu, the prices a relief and an insult at the same time. He could have bought this entire diner 1,000 times over, yet he was carefully calculating if he could afford a burger and a coffee. She appeared at his table, a pen and notepad in her hand. "What can I get for you?" Her voice was clear, professional, with a hint of weariness. "Just coffee." "Black," he grunted, not looking up from the menu. It was a test. He was projecting misery and brusqueness, wanting to see her reaction. He expected impatience, a sigh, maybe an eye roll. "Rough day?" He looked up, surprised. Her expression wasn't pitying. It was just observant. A simple acknowledgement. "You have no idea," he muttered. "We get a lot of those in here," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I'll get your coffee. Let me know if you change your mind. The meatloaf is cheap and it'll stick to your ribs." She walked away, and he watched her. There was no fawning, no forced cheerfulness, just a quiet competence. He had expected to be treated like an inconvenience, another faceless, poor man. Instead, he was being treated like a person. It was unsettling. She returned with a thick, chipped ceramic mug of steaming coffee. She placed it down gently. "On the house," she said quietly. "You look like you need it more than I need the $1.50. Alexander stared at her. "Why?" The word came out sharper than he intended. She didn't flinch. She just looked him straight in the eye. "Because my shift ends in an hour, and I get to go home and sleep. You look like you don't know where you're going next. Sometimes a cup of coffee is just a cup of coffee, and sometimes it's a reason to sit in the warm for 10 more minutes. Drink up." She turned and went back to wiping down the counter, leaving him speechless. His mind, the finely tuned machine that analyzed markets and predicted human behavior based on self-interest, was short-circuiting. This wasn't a transaction. She gained nothing from this. In fact, she lost the price of the coffee. It didn't make sense. It was an anomaly in his dataset. He drank the coffee. It was bitter and strong, but it was the warmest thing he'd felt all week. He sat there for a long time, watching her. He saw her patiently explain the menu to the elderly woman, saw her share a quick, knowing joke with one of the truckers, saw her slip the leftover pastries from the display case into a bag, which she later gave to a homeless man who came to the back door, never letting him step inside, but always ensuring he didn't leave empty-handed. Her name tag read Bella. Alexander, now Alex, left $2 on the table, more than the coffee was worth, but a paltry sum by his old standards. As he pushed the door open to leave, she called out without turning around. "Hey, it gets better." He didn't reply. He stepped back out into the cold, wet night. The bell tinkling behind him. The rain hadn't stopped, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than the cold. He was confused, annoyed even. His perfectly constructed experiment had just been contaminated by a single, inexplicable act of kindness from a tired waitress in a run-down diner. He told himself it was a fluke, an outlier. He knew, with a certainty that unnerved him, that he would be back. He had to understand the variable named Bella. Alex became a fixture at the Cornerstone Diner. He told himself it was for the sake of his experiment. The diner was a microcosm of the world he was studying, and Bella was the most perplexing subject within it. He would take the same corner booth every evening after his brutal shift at the warehouse, nursing a cheap coffee or a bowl of soup, and he would watch. He was a ghost at the feast, observing the small dramas of the diner's regulars. He saw Maria, the older waitress who worked the day shift, always limping slightly on her left leg. He saw Sal, the cook, a mountain of a man with tattoos up his arms who would yell at the waitstaff, but would always make a special, off-menu meal for a kid who was a picky eater. And he saw Bella, the quiet center of this chaotic little universe. She learned his order. "The usual, Alex. Black coffee and a water?" she'd ask, already reaching for the pot. He remained curt, distant, a persona he maintained to test her limits. He never smiled, never offered more than one-word answers. He was the embodiment of a difficult customer, designed to wear down her patience and reveal the transactional core he was so sure lay beneath. But it never came. Her kindness was relentlessly consistent. It wasn't bubbly or effusive. It was a practical, grounded sort of compassion. He saw her chase a customer down the street who had forgotten his wallet. He saw her calmly de-escalate an argument between two men over a sports game. He watched her spend 15 minutes on her break helping an elderly man, Mr. Gable, figure out his new smartphone, her finger patiently tapping the screen. Each act was a small crack in the wall of Alexander's cynicism. He started to feel a grudging respect, which morphed into a disquieting curiosity. Who was this woman? Where did this reservoir of empathy come from? One evening, he overheard her on the payphone near the restrooms. Her voice was low and tense, a stark contrast to her calm demeanor on the floor. "No, I told you. I'll have the rest by Friday. I know he needs it. Don't you think I know that? I'm working 2 extra shifts this week. I just need a little more time." There was a long pause. "Okay, I'll figure it out. I always do." She hung up and leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the phone box for a long moment. When she turned, she saw Alex watching her. Her professional mask snapped back into place, but not before he saw the flash of raw panic and exhaustion in her eyes. It was a vulnerability so profound it felt like a punch to the gut. "Everything all right?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. It was a break in his own character. She gave him a tight, dismissive smile. "Just life. Can I get you a refill?" The interaction, though brief, changed something. He was no longer just an observer, he was a witness. He started noticing the finer details, the way she would discreetly add up the bill for customers she knew were struggling, sometimes forgetting to add the price of the soda. The worn-out soles of her sneakers held together near the toe with a strip of black tape. The slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, a sign of sheer exhaustion. His experiment was becoming deeply personal. He found himself feeling a protective anger on her behalf. Who was she talking to on the phone? What did she need money for so desperately? For the first time, he felt the suffocating powerlessness of his disguise. As Alexander Sterling, he could solve her problems with a single phone call. As Alex, the broke construction worker, he could do nothing but watch. The frustration was a novel and deeply unpleasant feeling. He, a man who reshaped skylines and dictated the flow of global commerce, couldn't even help a single waitress. He was trapped in the prison of his own making. One night, a young man, barely a teenager, came in trying to sell cheap, wilted roses from a bucket. He was thin and shivering. Most customers waved him away with annoyance. When he approached Alex's table, Alex just shook his head, sticking to his role. But then the boy went to Bella at the counter. "Please, lady, just one. My mum's sick," the boy pleaded. Bella looked at the boy, her gaze softening. She reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill. Alex knew for a fact that this was a significant portion of her tips for the night. "I don't need a rose, sweetie," she said softly. "But here, get your mum some soup from the place down the street. It's better than flowers." She pressed the money into his hand. The boy stared at her, his eyes wide. "But why?" Bella just smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "Because my mum liked soup too. Now go on." The boy left, clutching the money. Alex sat in his booth, the cynical billionaire, the master of the universe, and felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Shame. He had set out to prove that kindness was a myth. Instead, he was watching it being demonstrated, night after night, by a woman who had far less than him and gave far more. She wasn't doing it for an audience or for a reward. She was doing it because it was who she was. He looked down at his own hands. They felt useless. He had built an empire on the premise of cold, hard logic. But the simple, illogical act of a waitress giving away her last few dollars to a stranger had just dismantled his entire worldview. The facade of Alex was cracking, and Alexander Sterling was beginning to feel the terrifying, unfamiliar light shining through. He was no longer in control of his experiment. In fact, he was starting to suspect he was the one being studied. The storm arrived without warning. 1 minute, the city was sweltering under a late summer heat wave. The next, the sky turned a bruised purple grey and the heavens opened. It wasn't just rain, it was a biblical deluge. Water sheeted down, turning streets into raging rivers and overwhelming the city's ancient drainage system in minutes. Alex had just finished his shift, soaked to the bone, and trudging towards the cornerstone for his nightly ritual of observation. By the time he reached the diner's door, the water was already ankle-deep on the sidewalk. He pushed inside, shaking like a wet dog, and found the small diner transformed into a chaotic sanctuary. Every booth was full. People who had been caught in the downpour had flocked inside, their faces a mixture of annoyance and relief. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and the rising humidity. Bella was a whirlwind of motion, a lone ship's captain navigating a sudden squall. Maria had already gone home for the day, and Sal was trapped in the kitchen by a mountain of orders. It was just Bella on the floor, handling a crowd that had tripled in size. Alex slid into his usual booth, but for the first time, he didn't feel like an observer. He felt like part of the collective chaos. He watched Bella, amazed. She never lost her cool. She consolidated orders, reassured anxious parents with crying children, and moved with a purpose that seemed to calm the entire room. Then, with a loud buzz and a fizzle, the lights flickered violently and died. The jukebox cut out mid-song. A collective groan went through the diner, now plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by the frantic flashes of lightning outside and the glow of a few cell phones. Panic began to bubble. A child started to cry loudly. "Everybody stay calm!" Bella's voice cut through the darkness, steady and clear. "It's just the power. Sal, you got the emergency candles?" "On it!" a voice boomed from the kitchen. A moment later, Sal appeared with a handful of thick candles, and he and Bella began placing them around the room. The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows, turning the diner into an intimate, cavernous space. The atmosphere shifted from panic to a kind of weary, shared experience. An hour passed. The rain only intensified. The water level outside was rising, now halfway up the diner's front window. They were trapped. That's when the new problem started. A steady drip, drip, drip came from the ceiling near the kitchen door. It quickly became a trickle, then a small but steady stream, pouring directly onto a section of loose floor tiles. "Damn it," Sal muttered, placing a bucket under the leak. "Old building. Happens every time we get a real gully washer." Alex watched the water. He noticed it wasn't just leaking, it was pooling near a junction box on the wall, the very one that likely housed the main circuit breaker. He might be pretending to be a simple laborer, but decades of building state-of-the-art facilities meant he knew a thing or two about infrastructure. Water and high-voltage electricity were a catastrophic combination. Without thinking, he stood up. "You need to shut off the main power at the breaker," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made several people look at him. "If that water hits the junction box, you'll have a major electrical fire." Sal and Bella looked at him, surprised. "I know," Sal grumbled, "but the main shutoff is in the basement. The stairwell is already flooded. No way I'm wading through that in the dark." Alex's mind was racing. He was Alexander Sterling. He solved impossible problems for a living. This was a simple logistical challenge. He scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the candlelight. He spotted the heavy-duty fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. "Give me that," he said to Sal, pointing. "And I need a pair of those thick rubber gloves you use for cleaning the grill." He strode over, took the heavy extinguisher, and grabbed the gloves from a bewildered Sal. He walked to the growing puddle. "Everyone stay back," he commanded. He wasn't Alex, the downtrodden worker, anymore. He was a man in charge. Using the hard plastic base of the extinguisher, he began to pry up the loose floor tiles, creating a channel to divert the water away from the wall and towards a floor drain on the other side of the room. It was messy, physical work. His hands were scraped, and his cheap clothes were soon covered in grimy water. But it worked. The immediate danger to the junction box was averted. He stood up, breathing heavily, and met Bella's gaze from across the room. She was staring at him, her expression a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite read: respect. The crisis had broken the strange barrier between them. Later, as things quieted down and the storm settled into a steady roar, she brought him a fresh cup of coffee and a thick slice of apple pie. "Thanks," she said, sitting in the booth opposite him. It was the first time she'd ever sat with a customer. "You didn't have to do that. You probably saved us from a much bigger problem." "Instinct," he mumbled, feeling awkward, his Alex persona feeling flimsy and ill-fitting. "That wasn't instinct," she corrected him gently. "That was knowledge. You knew exactly what you were doing. Not many construction workers I know can diagnose an electrical hazard that fast." He stiffened, realizing his mistake. He had let the mask slip. "Worked on a lot of different sites," he lied, hoping it was convincing. She let it go, but he could tell a seed of curiosity had been planted. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the rain. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly, the question that had been burning in him for weeks. "Why are you so kind to everyone, even when they don't deserve it? Even when you're clearly—" He stopped himself before he said, struggling. She looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her own coffee mug. "My little brother, Leo," she said, her voice soft. "He's sick. He has cystic fibrosis. He's been in and out of hospitals his whole life. Some days are good, some are really bad. Living with that, you learn. You learn that you never know what battle someone else is fighting. The angry guy at counter 3 might have just lost his job. The woman who complains about her toast might have a sick kid at home. A little bit of kindness is the only thing that doesn't cost anything to give away, but sometimes it's everything to the person who receives it. She looked up at him, her brown eyes clear and profound in the candlelight. I guess I try to put the kind of good out into the world that I hope is surrounding my brother when I can't be with him. Alexander felt the full weight of her words land on him. It wasn't a complex algorithm or a strategic decision. It was simple. It was pure. It was a philosophy born not of abundance, but of hardship. He thought of his own sister, whom he hadn't spoken to in 3 years over a business dispute. He thought of the emptiness of his penthouse, filled with priceless art but devoid of any warmth. Bella's world was circumscribed by the 4 walls of this diner and a hospital room, and yet it felt infinitely larger and more meaningful than his own. I'm sorry about your brother, he said, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. Thank you, she whispered. The storm raged on outside, but inside the candlelit diner, the real storm was happening inside Alexander Sterling. He had come here to prove the world was a dark and selfish place. But in the darkness, a woman sustained by love and hope had just shown him the light, and he knew, with terrifying certainty, that his life would never be the same. The experiment was over, but what came next, he had no idea. The storm eventually subsided, leaving a clean, rain-washed city in its wake. But for Alex, the internal tempest had just begun. Bella's revelation about her brother had changed the entire dynamic of his experiment. It was no longer a detached, academic exercise. It was now deeply, uncomfortably human. He found himself unable to stay away from the diner, but his reasons had shifted. He was no longer observing Bella as a data point. He was drawn to her strength, her quiet dignity. He started talking to her more, letting the gruff, monosyllabic Alex fade away, replaced by a more thoughtful, inquisitive man. He learned that Leo was 13, that he loved science fiction and drawing, and that his latest hospital stay was due to a severe lung infection. He also learned, through careful, gentle questions, about the true nature of their financial nightmare. There was a new experimental drug therapy, a gene modulator called Trikafta. It wasn't a cure, but for many with Leo's specific genetic mutation, it was a miracle, capable of extending life expectancy by decades and dramatically improving quality of life. The problem? The treatment cost over $300,000 a year, and their insurance company was dragging its feet, classifying it as experimental and not medically necessary, a cruel bureaucratic loophole that was effectively a death sentence. Bella spoke of it with a kind of desperate pragmatism, as if discussing an impossibly high mountain she simply had to find a way to climb. "I'm saving," she'd said with a humorless laugh. "At this rate, I might have enough for his first dose by the time he's 30. Hearing this, Alexander felt a rage so pure and white-hot it almost made him physically ill. $300,000. To him, this was the price of a watch he'd once bought on a whim in Geneva. It was a rounding error on a quarterly report. It was nothing. Yet for Bella and Leo, it was the entire world. The injustice of it was a physical weight. The powerlessness was maddening. He, Alexander Sterling, the man who could liquidate assets worth billions with a thumbprint, was sitting in a vinyl booth, unable to do a thing. If he suddenly produced the money, his cover would be blown. The fragile, genuine connection he was building with Bella would be shattered, tainted by the lie. She would see him not as Alex, the man who helped divert a flood, but as a deceitful billionaire who had been playing a cruel game with her life. The pressure continued to mount from another direction. The diner's owner, A kind but financially inept man named George was behind on his rent. The building's landlord, a notoriously ruthless property developer named Mr. Henderson, had been plastering notices on the door. One afternoon, Henderson himself swaggered in. He was a portly man in a cheap, shiny suit with a sneer permanently etched on his face. "George, time's up," Henderson announced loudly, for all the customers to hear. "The rent is 3 months overdue. I've got a new tenant lined up, a chain coffee shop. They're willing to pay double. You've got 2 weeks to pay in full, or you're out." Bella stepped forward, her hands on her hips. "Mr. Henderson, you know George is trying. We had the flood damage." "Not my problem, sweetheart," Henderson sneered, looking her up and down dismissively. "This is business. Pay up or pack up." Alex watched from his booth, his hands clenched into fists under the table. He knew Henderson, or rather, Alexander Sterling knew of him. Henderson was a bottom feeder, known for buying up properties in gentrifying neighborhoods and using predatory tactics to force out long-term tenants. Sterling Dynamics had even considered a hostile takeover of Henderson's small company once, just to liquidate it, but had deemed it too insignificant to bother with. Seeing this parasite bully Bella made something inside Alex snap. The careful artifice he had maintained for weeks crumbled. He stood up. "You can't just throw them out," Alex said, his voice low and dangerously calm. "There are commercial tenancy laws, eviction moratoriums to consider, especially after a natural disaster declaration." Henderson turned, laughing. "And who are you? Her lawyer? You look like you just crawled out of a ditch. Mind your own business before you get hurt." "This place is a neighborhood institution," Alex pressed on, walking towards him. "Forcing them out for a soulless chain is not just immoral. It's a stupid business move. The goodwill you'll lose—" "Goodwill doesn't pay my mortgage, pal," Henderson spat. "This building is mine, and I'll do what I want with it." And that's when Alexander Sterling broke through. The frustration, the rage at his own helplessness, the disgust for this man. It all boiled over. "This building?" Alex said with a chillingly quiet laugh. "This insignificant little brick box? I could buy this building with the loose change in my car's cup holder. I could buy your entire pathetic portfolio and turn it into a string of homeless shelters just to spite you. You are a gnat, Henderson, a tiny, insignificant gnat, and you are starting to annoy me." The diner went silent. Sal froze with a spatula in his hand. Bella stared, her eyes wide with shock. Henderson was speechless for a moment, his smug expression replaced by confusion. The words, the tone, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance and power, they didn't belong to Alex, the out-of-work laborer. They belonged to a king, to a titan. Henderson recovered, sputtering. "You're crazy. You're a crazy, broke bum." He pointed a chubby finger at George. 2 weeks! He then stormed out of the diner, unnerved but dismissive. The spell was broken. Alex stood there, his chest heaving, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a cold dread. He looked at Bella. The respect and budding friendship he had seen in her eyes were gone, replaced by a deep, searching suspicion. The way he had spoken, the specific financial terminology, the air of absolute authority. It was all wrong. She said nothing. She just picked up a rag and began wiping down a perfectly clean counter, her movements stiff and mechanical. The rest of the evening passed in a thick, unbearable silence. That night, Bella couldn't sleep. The man's words echoed in her mind. "I could buy this building with the loose change in my car's cup holder." It was the kind of boastful nonsense you'd hear from a drunk, but there had been no hint of alcohol in Alex's voice. There had only been the cold, hard certainty of fact. Her mind raced back over the past few weeks. His strange, out-of-place knowledge during the storm. His hands, which had calluses from the warehouse work, but a structure and care that hinted at a different life. The way he watched things, not like a man down on his luck, but like an analyst studying a foreign species. Driven by a sudden, undeniable instinct, she went to the small library down the street the next morning before her shift. She sat down at a public computer. She didn't know what she was looking for. She typed in, "Billionaire buys Henderson property." A wild guess. Nothing. Then she tried, "richest men in the city." A list of familiar names appeared. She scrolled through the faces. And then she saw him. Her breath caught in her throat. The picture was from a business magazine cover. He was older looking, his hair perfectly styled, his face clean-shaven, and he was wearing an expensive suit. But there was no mistaking it. The same intense grey eyes, the same jawline, the same chilling arrogance she had seen yesterday. The name under the photo was Alexander Sterling. She clicked on the article. Words and numbers swam before her eyes. COO of Sterling Dynamics. Net worth estimated at $87 billion as a reclusive genius. Philanthropic endeavors. The world tilted on its axis. Every interaction, every conversation, every moment of perceived connection replayed in her mind, now cast in a horrifying, fraudulent light. The coffee she gave him, her story about Leo, her hopes, her fears, she had shared them all. And all along, he wasn't Alex. He was a billionaire playing a game. She was the game. Her poverty, her struggle, her life. It was all just part of his field study. A wave of nausea and violation washed over her. It wasn't just a lie. It was a desecration. He had taken something pure, her belief in simple human connection, and made it a spectacle for his own amusement or research. That evening, when he walked into the diner and slid into his usual booth, he found her waiting for him. There was no notepad in her hand, no offer of coffee. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and her brown eyes, which had once looked at him with compassion, were now as hard and cold as flint. "Hello, Alexander," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. The unmasking was complete. The name, spoken in the familiar, warm acoustics of the diner, landed like a shard of ice in his gut. Alexander Sterling. He hadn't heard anyone but Marcus say it in a month, and hearing it from her lips felt like a judgment. He froze, the carefully constructed identity of Alex dissolving into nothing. There was no point in denying it. The look in her eyes told him she knew everything. "Bella," he began, his voice raspy. "I can explain." "Can you?" she asked, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled fury. She took a step closer, leaning her hands on the table, creating a cage around him in the booth. "Can you explain what it's like to be a science experiment? To have a man with more money than God watch you, study you, take notes on your life as if you were a rat in a maze? Was I just interesting data for your next philanthropic project?" Her voice was low, but it carried across the quiet diner. Sal, sensing the tension, disappeared into the kitchen. The few remaining customers suddenly found the contents of their plates fascinating. "It wasn't like that," he said, hating how weak he sounded. "It started that way, I won't lie to you. But it changed." "Oh, it changed?" she scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping her. "When did it change? Was it before or after you let me pour my heart out to you about my sick brother? Were you secretly recording that too? Thinking, fascinating, the emotional response of the lower-class female when faced with familial illness. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, did my performance meet your expectations?" Every word was a blow. He could see the profound hurt behind the anger, the sense of utter betrayal. He had wanted to see if genuine kindness existed, and in the process he had committed an act of profound cruelty. It was never a performance, he insisted, standing up, needing to be on her level. Everything you did, everything you are, it was real. You were the one who was real in all of this. And you were the lie, she shot back, her voice cracking. Every single thing about you was a lie. Your name, your story, your poverty. You let me give you a free coffee on your first night here. A free coffee. Do you have any idea what $1.50 means to me? The satisfaction I felt, thinking I was helping someone who had less than I did. You stole that from me. You turned my compassion into a joke. He felt his own defenses rise, the old, arrogant Alexander Sterling wanting to take control, to manage the situation. I can fix this, he said, his voice taking on the clipped, efficient tone of a CEO. Your brother, Leo, the drug he needs. The money is not an issue. I can write a check right now. It will be taken care of. Henderson, the landlord. Consider him dealt with. I'll buy this building and give George a 99-year lease for $1 a year. Whatever you need, whatever problems you have, I can solve them. He thought he was offering a solution. He saw it as penance, as a way to use his power for good and undo the damage. He had never been more wrong. Bella stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into disgust. She slowly shook her head. You still don't get it, she whispered, the raw disappointment in her voice more cutting than her anger. After all this, after everything you've seen in here, you still think money is the answer. You think you can lie, cheat, and humiliate someone, and then just write a check to wipe the slate clean? She backed away from the table, creating a chasm between them. You didn't learn a thing, did you? My kindness, the kindness you were supposedly looking for, it isn't for sale. My dignity is not for sale. My trust, which you shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, cannot be bought back at any price. She pointed a trembling finger at him. You wanted to see if the deserving poor exist. Well, let me tell you something. We exist. But we don't want your pity, and we don't want your charity when it comes from a place of deceit. What we want is respect. The basic human respect you couldn't be bothered to give me. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was stripped bare, not of his wealth, but of his justifications. She was right. He had been so focused on the lesson she was teaching him, he had completely ignored the price she was paying for his education. I don't want your money, Alexander, she said, her voice regaining its strength. I will figure out how to help my brother on my own. I always have. And George and I will figure out how to deal with Henderson. What I want is for you to leave. Bella, please, leave, she repeated, her voice now steel. Get out of my diner. Go back to your penthouse and your spreadsheets and your billions. You have no place here. You are not Alex, and I have no interest in knowing Alexander Sterling. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the diner pressing in on him. He looked at her face, seeing not the warm, compassionate woman he had come to admire, but a stranger whose eyes were filled with the pain he had caused. He had never felt so poor in his entire life. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the Cornerstone Diner, the bell on the door tinkling a final, mournful goodbye. He stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked back at the warm yellow light. He had entered this world as a king in disguise, seeking to confirm his cynical beliefs. He was leaving it as a fool, having found something true and beautiful, only to destroy it with his own arrogance. The reckoning was over, and he had lost. Alexander Sterling did not go back to his penthouse. He couldn't. The thought of its sterile, silent luxury was repulsive to him. He checked into an anonymous hotel, the kind used by businessmen for short stays, and for 2 days he did something he hadn't done in over a decade. Nothing. He sat. He thought. Bella's words echoed in his mind. "You still think money is the answer." She was right. His reflexive solution to the mess he'd made was to throw money at it, to treat it like a hostile takeover or a failing subsidiary. It was the only way he knew how to operate. He had spent his entire adult life believing that wealth was power, and power was the ultimate tool to shape the world to his will. But he couldn't will Bella to forgive him. He couldn't purchase her trust. He realized his experiment had been flawed from the start. He had set out to find kindness, but what he'd truly needed to find was humility. The lesson wasn't about the people in the diner. It was about him. On the 3rd day, he called Marcus. "It's over," Alexander said, his voice hoarse. "Wire the 100 million to the Henderson Foundation. No, wait, cancel that." "Sir?" Marcus asked, confused. "I'm restructuring my philanthropy," Alexander said, a new resolve in his voice. "Completely. I don't want to just fund anonymous, faceless foundations anymore. I want to build something real." He didn't return to the diner. He respected Bella's wish for him to stay away. Instead, he began to work. But this time, he didn't use his money as a weapon or a band-aid. He used it as a scalpel, with precision, thought, and a newfound sense of purpose. His first move was against Henderson. He didn't just buy the diner's building. He tasked the most aggressive legal team at Sterling Dynamics with investigating Henderson's entire portfolio. They uncovered a pattern of code violations, tenant harassment, and financial fraud. Instead of a simple buyout, Alexander initiated a class action lawsuit on behalf of all of Henderson's tenants, funding it personally. He didn't just save the cornerstone, he dismantled a predator's entire operation, ensuring he could never exploit anyone else again. The ownership of the diner building was quietly transferred to a trust in George's name, the paperwork handled by a third-party lawyer who never mentioned Sterling. Next, he tackled the problem of Leo. He didn't just write a check. He knew that would be rejected as charity. Instead, he mobilized his vast resources to attack the root of the problem. He established a multi-billion-dollar medical foundation, the Leo Rossi Foundation for Patient Advocacy. Its sole stated mission was to fight insurance companies on behalf of families who were denied life-saving treatments. His team of lawyers and medical experts descended upon Bella's insurance provider with overwhelming force, not just for Leo, but for every patient they had denied. Faced with a legal and public relations nightmare orchestrated by one of the world's richest men, the company folded within a week. Leo's treatment was approved, fully covered. The foundation was made permanent, a lasting legacy to help thousands of others like him. He learned that Bella was in her final year of nursing school, juggling her studies with her shifts at the diner. He made an anonymous 9-figure donation to her city college's nursing program, endowing a new scholarship fund that covered full tuition and living expenses for any student maintaining a certain GPA who also worked more than 20 hours a week. The very next day, Bella was called into the dean's office and informed that she was the first recipient of the new Working Hand Scholarship, and her financial burdens were over. She would never know where the money truly came from. He did all of this from a distance, through layers of lawyers and proxies, a ghost in the machine. He was fixing the problems, but in the way Bella had taught him, by addressing the systemic injustices, not just patching the symptoms. A month later, his work was done. He had changed countless lives, but the one connection he truly craved remained broken. He knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness, but he had to try. He went to the diner one last time. It was early afternoon, before the dinner rush. He wasn't dressed as Alex or as the billionaire Alexander Sterling. He wore simple trousers and a plain button-down shirt. He looked like just a man. Bella was there, prepping for her shift. She looked different. The deep-set exhaustion in her eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, bright hope. She looked healthy, rested. When she saw him, she didn't scowl. She just watched him, her expression unreadable as he walked to the counter. "Hello, Bella," he said quietly. "I heard about what happened to Henderson," she said, her voice even. "And Leo, his treatment was approved. They said it was a policy review. And my school, a new scholarship." She looked him straight in the eye. "You have a very subtle touch for a man who talks about buying buildings with pocket change." He didn't deny it. "I tried to do it right this time." "Why?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered. "Why do all that?" "Because you were right," he said, and the admission was the most honest thing he'd said in years. "I was a man living in a gilded cage, and I thought the whole world was made of bars. You showed me it wasn't. You taught me that kindness isn't a transaction, it's a strength. And you taught me that wealth isn't a tool for control, it's a tool for responsibility. I didn't do all of that to earn your forgiveness, Bella. I did it because after meeting you, I had a responsibility to be a better man." Bella was quiet for a long time, wiping down the counter with a cloth. He waited, prepared to be told to leave again. Finally, she stopped. She turned and pulled a clean, thick ceramic mug from the shelf, the same kind she'd given him on his first night. She filled it with coffee from the pot. She slid it across the counter towards him. "This one's $1.50, she said, a tiny, hesitant smile finally gracing her lips. "But I have a feeling you can afford it this time." Alexander looked at the coffee, then back at her. Her smile wasn't one of forgiveness. Not yet. It was something more valuable. It was an opening, a second chance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few dollars, placing them on the counter. "Thank you, Bella," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if they would ever be friends, or anything more. But as he sat there, drinking a simple cup of coffee in a diner that now felt more like home than his penthouse ever had, he knew one thing for sure. He had gone looking for the price of kindness, and had learned in the end that it was priceless, and that was a lesson worth more than all the billions in his bank account. That was the story of Alexander Sterling and Isabella Rossi, a story that reminds us that a person's true worth is not measured by the contents of their wallet, but by the compassion in their heart. Alexander learned that the most valuable investments you can make are not in stocks or real estate, but in people. And Bella, through her unwavering integrity, showed us all that true strength isn't about how much you can take from the world, but about how much you are willing to give. If this story touched your heart and made you think, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps our channel grow. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the power of kindness. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. What did you think of Alexander's transformation? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Until next time, remember to be the reason someone believes in the goodness of people.